The year is 332 BC. When Alexander the Great finally broke into Tyre, even some of his own men went silent, not because they had never seen a city fall. They had. But Tyre was different. For 7 months, the island city had kept him outside, and when the wall finally gave way, Alexander did not enter like a man ending a siege. He entered like a man answering an insult. Inside the temple of Melkart, King Azamilcus stood near the altar. For months, every danger had reached him as a report, a shortage, a damaged tower, a harbor warning, a crack in the wall. There had always been parchment. There had always been a messenger. There had always been one more decision. But this time, no one had to bring him news. The city itself was giving it to him. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lamps trembled. Matan, the priest who had served there since boyhood, stopped in the middle of the morning prayer. The words stayed in his mouth. Then the wall changed sound. Low, deep, wrong. On the southern wall, Hiram felt the stone shift beneath his feet. He had guarded Tyre for 16 years. He had trusted the sea all his life. But the sound was not coming from the water. It was coming from under him. Dust drifted from the stone. The crack widened beneath his feet. For 7 months, danger had come from across the water. Now it was inside the wall. No one shouted at first. They did not need to. The sea had failed. The wall was next. Inside the temple, another horn sounded outside. Matan turned to Azamilcus. What now? Azamilcus did not answer. His hand tightened against the altar stone. For 7 months, every danger had still left him one more decision, another delay, another answer. Another morning the sea still gave him. This time there was nothing left to delay. Then he looked at Matan. Now we find out what our refusal cost. And then the breach opened. The first Macedonians came through in dust and iron. What followed was the part even Alexander's own men would remember in silence. To understand why Tyre reached that moment, you have to go back 7 months, back to the day Azamilcus still believed the sea gave kings time. Tyre had trusted the sea for centuries. So had its kings. That trust was not foolish. It had been earned. The true city stood offshore, half a mile from the mainland. Its walls rose almost straight out of the Mediterranean. Its harbors were deep. Its ships were fast. Its people knew tides, wind, rope, salt, and distance. A city on land can be surrounded. A city on an island can wait. Azamilcus knew this better than anyone. He had inherited a city built on patience. Assyrian kings had threatened Tyre. Babylonian armies had pressed against it. Empires had stood on the mainland and shouted promises across the waves. Then time passed. Armies grew tired. Kings died. The sea remained. That was the lesson every Tyrian ruler learned. Do not answer too quickly. Do not bend too soon. Do not mistake noise from the mainland for power inside the walls. Azamilcus had survived as kings of trading cities survive. Not by rage, by balance. Gifts when needed, silence when useful. Delay when danger came too close. Refusal only when there was no other way. He knew how to bend without breaking. He knew how to honor a powerful man without letting him inside the city. So when Alexander arrived, Azamilcus did what he had always done. He watched. From the wall, the Macedonian king looked smaller than his name. a man in armor, a figure near the shore, a danger kept in its proper place. Below, the sea moved between army and city. That mattered. Hiram stood on the wall nearby, leaning on his spear. A guard beside him smiled. Let him stare. Hiram looked at the water and smiled too. Azamilkas heard the laughter. He did not correct it. At that distance, Alexander still looked like a problem the sea could help solve. Inside the temple of Melkart, Matan lit the morning lamps as he had done since boyhood. Oil, wick, flame, prayer. Every morning, before the city fully woke, the lamps burned. That morning, Matan's hands were steady. The city still had its rituals. The sea still held its distance. And Azamilkas still believed a careful answer could keep Tyre whole. But Alexander was not the kind of danger balance could easily hold. Alexander did not begin by demanding blood. He asked for entry. That was worse. He wanted to enter Tyre. He wanted to sacrifice inside the temple of Melkart, the god he connected with Heracles. To outsiders, it sounded like religion. Inside Tyre, it sounded like surrender. Azamilkas stood with priests and commanders in the council chamber. Through the open windows, the harbor moved below them. Ropes creaked. Water struck stone. Men spoke in low voices near the docks. No one in the room believed Alexander only wanted to pray. Matan stood beside the other priests. His hands were folded inside his sleeves, but his thumb pressed hard against his palm. Finally, he spoke. If he enters the temple, he has entered Tyre. Azamilkas looked toward the harbor, not at Matan, not at the commanders, at the water. Then he stays outside. So they refused Alexander carefully. No drawn swords, no insult from the walls, no shouting that could not be taken back. They sent a polite answer. Alexander could sacrifice at the older temple on the mainland. He could be honored there. He could be respected there. But he would not enter Tyre. It was a small word dressed in diplomacy. No, the messengers left by boat. No one spoke until the oars touched the water. Matan looked toward the harbor. Will he accept it? Azamilkas did not answer at once. He watched the small boat move toward the mainland. Then he said quietly, "Men like Alexander do not accept refusal. They remember it." The room stayed quiet. Below them, the harbor still moved. The ropes still creaked. The water still struck stone. But something had changed. Azamilkas could feel it. The sea between Alexander and Tyre no longer felt empty. It felt like time being counted. The messengers returned across the water. No answer came back that day. No shouting from the mainland. No attack. No signal of acceptance. Only Alexander still standing near the shore, watching Tyre. By morning, men on the wall saw Macedonian soldiers carrying baskets of stone. The first stones seemed harmless. That was what unsettled Azamilkas later. Not how violent the beginning was, how ordinary it looked. No drums, no fire, no charge, just men carrying rubble to the shore. From the wall, Azamilkas watched Macedonian workers drag broken pieces of old mainland Tyre toward the water. Stones, timbers, fragments of houses, fragments of shrines, pieces of a Tyre that had already died on land. The soldiers carried them to the shore. Then they dumped them into the shallows. The sea swallowed the first stones. Hiram laughed from the wall. They are building into the sea. Another guard spat over the stones. Let them. Azamilkas heard the laughter. He did not join it. By afternoon, the water looked unchanged. By evening, reports came to him saying the same thing. The Macedonians were wasting labor. The sea would take the stones. The waves would tear the work apart. Azamilkas read the reports once. Then again, he wanted to believe them. That night, inside the temple, Matan lit the lamps again. This time, the ritual was slower. He touched flame to wick, then paused. Azamilkas stood near the doorway longer than usual. Matan was listening, not for prayer, for stone. Matan noticed. "My king?" Azamilkas looked toward the harbor beyond the temple doors. Stones do not float. No. Azamilkas said nothing for a moment. Then he looked back toward the mainland. But men keep bringing them. By the third day, fewer men laughed. By the seventh, nobody did. Every morning, Azamilkas climbed the wall. Every morning, the road was easier to see. Every morning, it looked less foolish. Waves tore at the edges. The Macedonians brought more. Men slipped and vanished beneath the water. Others dragged stone forward anyway. Tyrian arrows fell from the walls. More workers came. The causeway grew slowly, a brown wound pushing out from the mainland. It did not look fast. That made it harder to dismiss. Fast things could fail. This thing simply continued. Inside Tyre, people began to measure the day by the road. Not by sunrise, not by bells, not by the market, by the road. Hiram measured it too. At first he guessed its distance. Then he marked it against things he knew. The first outcrop, the line of darker water, the old mooring stone. One morning, Azamilkas saw Hiram reach the wall and stop before anyone spoke. The guard already knew where the road would be before he looked. That was when Azamilkas understood. Something had changed in the city. The road was no longer only outside the walls. It had entered people's mornings. Whatever waited at the end of that road was getting closer. A boy stood beside his father, near the wall. "The road is closer," the boy said. The father placed one hand on his shoulder. It was meant to calm him. But Azamilkas saw the hand tremble. The boy felt it too. The king turned away first, not because he did not care, because kings cannot look too long at the fear they helped create. A commander stood beside him and watched Macedonian men carrying stones into the surf. "They will tire," the commander said. Azamilkas kept staring at the road. "They have tired." The commander looked at him. Azamilkas said nothing for a moment, then, quietly, "But they are still building." After that, the commander did not say it again, and, by the next morning, Azamilkas understood something else. If the sea would not stop the road, Tyre would have to burn it. Tyre answered the way an island city answers. With the sea, ships moved out from the harbors. Anything that burned was gathered. Anything that floated could be used. Azamilkas walked the harbor while men prepared an old ship. At first, it looked like wreckage. Too slow, too heavy, almost dead. But the sailors filled it with dry wood, pitch, sulfur, and fire waiting to happen. Matan came down from the temple that evening and stood near the docks. He watched sailors weight the stern so the front of the ship would ride higher on the water. One sailor looked at him. "Pray for wind." Matan looked toward the west. "I already am." Azamilkas heard him. For the first time in days, the king almost smiled. The next day, the wind came. From the walls, the people watched. Azamilkas stood among the commanders. Hiram stood farther down the wall, gripping his spear. The fireship moved toward Alexander's towers. Slowly, then faster. The Macedonians saw it coming. Men shouted. Buckets were lifted. Orders crossed the water. Then the flames took hold. The ship struck. Fire climbed the towers. Smoke rolled across the causeway. Men jumped into the sea. Others burned where they stood. The hides covering the towers curled black. Timber cracked. The towers that had taken weeks to build became torches in front of the whole city. For the first time in weeks, Tyre made noise. Men shouted from the walls. Women cried out from rooftops. Children ran toward the harbor until mothers pulled them back. Hiram shouted too. He did not mean to. It came out of him like breath after being held too long. Inside the temple, Matan closed his eyes and whispered thanks to Melkart. For a few hours, the city remembered what victory felt like. But Azamilkas did not leave the wall. He watched the smoke drift over the causeway. For a moment, his face almost softened. A commander beside him said, "He will stop now." Azamilkas did not look away from the burning towers. No. The commander turned. Azamilkas swallowed once. He will learn from this. The city cheered below them. Azamilkas kept watching the smoke. They had not only stopped Alexander, they had embarrassed him in front of his army. The victory was real. But the road was still there, blackened, damaged, smoking. Still there. That night, Tyre did not celebrate the way it should have. There were prayers. There were whispers of victory. There were families who slept easier for a few hours. But in the council chamber, Azamilkas stood over a map and listened to the harbor quiet down. One commander spoke of repairs. Another spoke of supplies. Another said the towers were gone. Azamilkas looked at the road, not the towers, the road. By morning, the Macedonians returned. Hiram saw them first, men carrying stone. Again. The city had wounded Alexander's work. Alexander had answered by continuing. Azamilkas received the report in silence. Then he folded it carefully, as if making it smaller could make the danger smaller too. Outside, the smoke was thinning over the stones, and through it, Azamilkas could already see Alexander's men, measuring where the next towers would stand. After that, hope became more careful. It did not leave all at once. It learned to lower its voice. Markets opened, but later. Doors closed earlier. People stopped standing near the harbor unless they had to. Guards remained on the walls after their watches ended. Azamilkas saw these changes before anyone reported them. He saw them from windows, from balconies, from the wall. The city still moved, but it no longer moved the same way. Inside the temple, Matan still lit the lamps each morning, but the ritual changed. At first, he lit them to honor the god. Then he lit them because the city needed something that had not changed yet. Before each flame caught, he listened for stones, for engines, for the groan of wood from the Macedonian works. His prayers grew shorter, not because his faith had left him, because fear kept interrupting it. One morning, Azamilkas entered the temple before the city fully woke. He found fewer offerings near the altar, less bread, less oil, less incense. Matan saw him notice. Neither man spoke. The city was still standing, but it had begun to give less to the gods. Not out of disrespect, out of need. A merchant named Abdestat had opened his stall every morning for 20 years. Azamilkas knew the stall. Purple cloth, glass jars, small pieces of dyed thread for sailors' wives. At first the merchant still arranged his goods, but his eyes kept turning toward the harbor. By midday, he closed the stall. By the next week, he opened it later. Then some mornings, not at all. One morning, Azamilkas passed and saw the stall still shut. No notice, no explanation. Just the wooden front closed against the street. Hiram passed the same stall on his way to the wall. He did not stop. He did not need to ask why. People no longer asked only whether the wall would hold. They began asking quieter questions. What happens if it does not? What happens if he enters angry? Azamilkas heard that question once through an open doorway. A woman whispering, a man's answering too softly for the king to hear. He stopped for half a breath, then kept walking. A king cannot answer every fear. Sometimes he can only hear it and continue. Then the sea changed again. For generations, Tyre had trusted not only the water, but its ships. If the walls held and the harbors stayed open, the city could breathe. Food could come in, messages could leave, families could still imagine escape. But Alexander began gathering fleets. Phoenician cities that had submitted to him sent ships. Cyprus joined him. Greek ships came too. Day after day, sails appeared around Tyre that did not belong to Tyre. Azamilkas watched them from the wall. At first, commanders counted them for him. 12, 19, 30, then more, then too many. One morning, a younger guard asked Hiram, "How many now?" Hiram kept counting for a moment. Though he already knew there were too many, then he stopped. Enough. Azamilkas heard the answer. It stayed with him. After that, he counted differently too. Not the ships, the spaces between them, the open water, the places where a Tyrian boat might still slip through. Each morning, those spaces grew smaller. The harbor stopped feeling open. It felt watched. Ships closed around the island. Supplies became harder to bring in. Escape became thinner. The water still shone under the sun. But it no longer meant freedom. Inside the palace, the reports changed. Less grain, fewer safe passages. More ships seen at dawn. More ships seen at dusk. Azamilkas answered them because that was what kings do. Move stores, shift guards, delay panic, send another boat, repair another section. Speak calmly, stand straight. But each answer felt smaller than the question. Families stopped standing near the harbor. Children were pulled indoors. When Macedonian engines began to groan, men on the walls learned the sound of incoming stones, the deep wooden strain, the pause, the impact. No one needed to announce fear. People already knew when to lower their voices. They knew when to leave the harbor. They knew which streets to avoid when the engines began. At night, the questions moved through houses softly, not in speeches, not in crowds, in doorways, beside lamps, between mothers and sons. If the sea could close, what else could fail? And if the wall failed, what would Alexander bring through it? Azamilkas heard the question in the city, long before anyone asked it to his face. Outside the walls, the siege became more organized. Rams mounted on ships struck stone. Tyrian divers swam into the water and cut anchor cables. Alexander replaced the cables with chains. The Tyrians dropped stones into the sea to block the rams. Macedonian crews dragged them away. Cut, repair, burn, rebuild, strike, answer, again. Every day reports came to Azamilcus: a ram damaged, a chain found, a diver lost, a tower repaired, a harbor passage closed, a wall section weakened. He answered all of them. That was his function now, not king. Answer. The workers arrived. The engines were checked. The ships were moved into place. The wounded were carried back. The dead were moved aside. The road grew. There was something worse than chaos in that routine. Chaos feels like it might end. This returned each morning. Slowly, the siege became something both sides had to keep feeding. Tyre resisted, so Alexander built. Alexander built, so Tyre burned. Tyre burned, so Alexander rebuilt larger. Each answer made the next one necessary. Each day made mercy less likely. 7 months. Inside those 7 months were salt in infected wounds. Families counting grain. Guards sleeping beside walls. They no longer trusted. Matan lighting lamps with less oil each morning. Hiram staring at the same road until it appeared in his dreams. And Azamilcus reading reports that no longer brought relief. Another section repaired. Another attack survived. Another day held. Once, those words would have steadied him. Now, they made him look toward the wall. Every week, another certainty disappeared. First the sea, then the harbor, then the market, then the prayers, then the wall. Azamilcus still walked through the city. He still stood before the priests. He still spoke like a king, but Matan saw the tiredness in his face when the lamps were low. One night, inside the temple, the engines sounded again. Matan listened. His lips moved once, but no prayer came out. How long before the wall breaks? Azamilcus kept his eyes on the flame before the altar, long enough to make him remember us. It sounded brave, but his hand stayed close to the altar. Later, when another report came, Azamilcus unfolded it slowly. The city still held, the road still grew, the wall still weakened. He read the words once, then again. Tyre was surviving, and somehow that no longer felt like good news. Because every day Tyre survived, Alexander waited one more day. And every day, Alexander waited, the silence, after the reports grew heavier. The Macedonian engines kept hammering the walls. Not wildly, patiently. Stone does not feel pain, but men watching stone weaken do. A crack appears, dust falls, a section shifts. Hiram saw the first serious crack on the southern side. He did not shout, he just stared. The younger guard beside him followed his eyes. Is it deep? Hiram swallowed. Deep enough. The report reached Azamilcus before noon. He was in the council chamber. The messenger's hands were white around the tablet. Azamilcus took it, read it, folded it, placed it beside the others. A commander asked, "My king?" Azamilcus did not answer at first. From the open windows, he could hear the harbor. Ropes, water, men calling to one another. All the ordinary sounds of a city, still pretending the wall would hold. "Move children from the southern quarter," he said. No one in the room breathed for a moment. Then the commander bowed. After that, the wall became another ritual. Every morning, Hiram checked it. Every afternoon, he checked again. Azamilkus began doing the same in a different way. He checked faces. The guard who spoke too quickly. The merchant who avoided the southern road. The mother who pulled her son away from the wall before he could ask why. Inside Tyre, people felt the change before they admitted it. Children were told not to play near the southern quarter. Merchants stopped stacking goods too high on shelves. Matan noticed dust on the temple floor and looked up before he looked down. The city was listening to itself break. Some families stopped speaking of victory. They spoke of hiding places. Which rooms had thick doors? Which alleys led toward the temple? Which children could run fastest? No one said the worst thing aloud, but Azamilkus heard it anyway. The city had begun preparing for what might come after the war. Then came the day from the beginning. The wall changed sound before it fell. Hiram heard it under his feet. A deep crack moved through the stone. Dust fell in the temple. Matan stopped mid-prayer. Azamilkus gripped the altar. Outside, Macedonian horns cut through the smoke. The breach opened. The first Macedonians came through in dust and iron. The defenders fought because there was nowhere else to go. Behind them was the city. Behind the city, the sea. No open field, no forest, no mountain. Only alleys, temples, homes, and the knowledge that the wall had finally failed them. Hiram stood with the defenders near the breach. For one moment he saw the causeway behind the Macedonians. The road, the same road he had laughed at. The same road he had measured. The same road that had entered his sleep. Now men were crossing it into the city. His hand tightened around his spear. A soldier beside him whispered, "We held them so long." Hiram did not look away. Yes. Then the Macedonians hit the line. Street by street, Tyre began to die. The sound changed. Sieges have distant sounds, engines, horns, orders over water, stones hitting walls. But a sack has close sounds, doors breaking, feet on stairs, people running into rooms that cannot protect them, metal striking in narrow alleys, breathing, begging, silence arriving in small places. Tyre was no longer a fortress, it was a body. The breach was the wound. The streets carried the army inward, and Alexander's punishment moved from public war into private rooms. Matan remained in the temple as people fled inside. Some were wounded. Some carried children. Some carried nothing. One woman clutched a torn piece of cloth as if it were a child's hand. Azamilkus stood near the altar. His face was still. His eyes were not. Matan turned toward him, the sanctuary. Azamilkus looked at the people filling the temple, then toward the doors, as long as it holds. But outside, the city was being opened room by room. For 7 months, Azamilkus had feared the breach. Now he understood. The breach had only been the door, and when the killing slowed, the second violence began. The Macedonians had seen cities die before. They had seen gates break. They had seen streets filled with soldiers. They had seen what happens when walls open, but Tyre did not simply fall. It was broken into categories, counting, sorting, separating. Who was dead? Who was useful? Who could be sold? Who would be made into warning? A Macedonian soldier who had fought through the breach might still have blood on his hands. when the counting began. One moment he was fighting in an alley. The next he was guarding captives. A woman, an old man, a child holding nothing. His hand still gripped his spear, though no one was attacking him anymore. The living became captives. The captives became property. Families that had hidden together were pulled apart in daylight. Names no longer mattered the way they had in Tyre. Age mattered. Strength mattered. Use mattered. Some survived the sack. Then survival was taken from them and sold. The dead were gone. The living had to keep being handled, moved, counted, priced, separated. A mother who had survived the breach could still lose her child at the harbor. A man who had escaped the sword could still be bound for sale. A city that had fought to remain itself could watch its people turned into goods beneath the same sky. Survival did not mean mercy. Punishment continued after the sword slowed. Some fled to the temple of Melkart. There, Alexander spared King Azamilcus and others who had taken shelter. Matan saw Azamilcus survive. Then he heard the shouting outside continue. The king lived, but the city paid. For 7 months, Azamilcus had ruled a city. Alexander could not enter. Now he was alive, inside a city being divided. And even that was not the end of it. Alexander did not let Tyre's punishment stay inside Tyre. After the city fell, Alexander made an example of it. The city was no longer fighting. The counting had begun. The selling had begun. Men who had spent 7 months trying to enter Tyre finally stood inside it. That should have felt like victory. Instead, a strange quietness moved through the camp. Conversations ended sooner. Some soldiers stared toward the shoreline. Others avoided looking at it. No one was confused. The order had been understood the first time. That was the problem. Veterans who had marched with Alexander through years of war had heard many commands. This one felt different. The city had already fallen, yet the punishment was still growing. The men reportedly crucified along the shore were not hidden away. They faced the water. They faced the passing ships. They faced the road Alexander had forced into the sea. Azamilcus saw the shoreline from inside the ruins of his own city. For 7 months that shore had been the line Alexander could not cross. Now men looked at it and lowered their eyes. Sailors leaving Tyre saw them before they saw open water. Some looked once. Some did not look at all. But every ship carried the image away. A merchant standing near the harbor lowered his eyes when the first vessel passed. No one asked him what he had seen. No one needed to. The shoreline answered for him. By the next harbor, the story would arrive. Before the ships were unloaded, by the next city, gates would be watched differently. Fathers would stand longer beside their sons on the walls. Priests would pause before answering kings. And sailors would remember the coast of Tyre without needing to say much. The sea that once protected the city now carried the story away from it. Azamilcus watched ships leave. He had spent 7 months trying to keep Alexander outside Tyre. Now Alexander was leaving Tyre inside every ship. Inside Tyre, those who survived had to keep living. People returned to streets where others had been taken. Markets reopened because hunger was still there. Some families still avoided parts of the shoreline. After dark, Matan relit the lamps, oil, wick, flame, prayer, the same ritual. but not the same temple. The sandals on the stone were fewer. The prayers were softer. The empty spaces answered louder than voices. As Amilcus stood near the altar again, the place had survived. The ritual had survived. Even he had survived. But survival no longer sounded like mercy. Hiram returned to the wall after the city reopened. He did not lean on his spear anymore. He looked first at the road, then at the sea. For 16 years, he had trusted the water. Now he watched it move around the road. Alexander had left behind. As Amilcus saw him there once, the guard did not turn. The king did not call out. There was nothing left to command in that silence. The city had survived, but it had not escaped. As Amilcus returned to the wall after the city reopened, not to give orders, not to inspect damage, not because anyone had summoned him. He came because the road was still there. For a while he only stood above it. Behind him, Tyre had begun moving again. Doors were being repaired. Voices had returned to the market. Somewhere below, a hammer struck wood, stopped, then struck again. Life had returned in pieces, but in front of him, the sea no longer looked the way it had before. For years, Amilcus had trusted that water. He had trusted distance. He had trusted the old Tyrian lesson that land armies grew tired before islands did. Now the sea curved around the stones that had carried Alexander in. The road was quiet now. No towers, no shouting, no soldiers crossing in dust and iron. Just stone beneath shallow water. The same road Hiram had laughed at. The same road the city had measured. The same road that had entered men's sleep. It was still there. The victory had passed. The fire had passed. The shouting had passed. The road had not. As Amilcus looked at the water moving around it, once, that water had meant time. It had meant delay. It had meant one more answer. Now it moved around the thing that had ended all three. He did not need years to understand what had happened. The sea had not returned to Tyre. It had learned another shape. Behind him, the temple lamps still burned, but every flame lit fewer faces than before. Matan would keep lighting them. Hiram would keep walking the wall. The markets would keep opening, because hunger did not stop for grief. And Amilcus would keep being called king. But there was less kingdom in the word now. Tyre had survived. That was true. The walls still cast shadows. The harbors still held ships. The streets still carried footsteps. But the city had lost the thing it had trusted most. Not only safety, not only distance, the belief that the sea belonged to it. Over time, silt would gather around the causeway. The current would change. The water would learn the road so completely that children born later would not understand why old men looked at it in silence. They would not remember the first stones. They would not remember the laughter fading from the walls. They would not remember the morning when the city began measuring the sea by how much of it was left. But Amilcus remembered. He remembered the refusal, the reports, the smoke, the horns, the altar under his hand. The moment he understood, the breach had only been the door. He remembered the city being counted after it was broken. And he remembered the shoreline where men were left facing the sea. Alexander had moved on. That was what conquerors did. But Tyre stayed where he had changed it. And long after the army left, long after the shouting ended, long after the first survivors learned how to walk past empty houses without turning their heads. The road remained beneath the living city, not a monument, not a grave, something worse, a path, a reminder that once a king believed water could keep a conqueror outside, and Alexander taught the sea to carry him in.